He was not born strong. He was born afraid like all of us. In the northern mountains of Kyushu, where winter winds carved their signatures into the cliffs, a young man sought an answer he could not name. He carried a restless spirit, a trembling resolve, and the quiet shame of knowing his own weakness. Every breath felt borrowed. Every step felt uncertain. He wanted discipline, but discipline kept slipping through his fingers. He wanted strength, but fear wrapped itself around his ribs like cold iron. So he climbed. For 3 days he wandered through forests where even the crows refused to speak. On the 4th morning, he reached the old monastery, a place whispered about in the villages, where warriors once trained under the Hagakure Code. There, among stone lanterns and the scent of cedar, he met the old mentor, a man whose presence felt like the earth itself. Unmoving, unshaking, unbreakable. The mentor did not ask his name. He simply said, "If the spirit is weak, the sword will follow. Let us forge the spirit first." And so began the training not of blade or combat, but of the self. Discipline through silence, mastery through fear, transformation through surrender. The young man would learn that true strength is not born from victory, but from the courage to face one's own fragile ego. This is the tale of forging an unbreakable spirit through the ancient path of the warrior. The first morning in the northern mountains carried a sharp cold that reached through the young man's clothing and pressed directly against his bones. Frost clung to the stones beneath his feet, and the monastery, silent and unmoving, felt less like a building and more like an ancient creature observing him. The mentor stood in the courtyard with the same stillness he had shown the night before, as if carved from the mountain itself. Without ceremony, without instruction, he pointed to a flat stone and told the young man to sit. The simplicity of the command made the young man uneasy. It felt as if something important was being hidden inside the quiet. He sat with his legs crossed, his spine stiff, trying to mimic the posture of the monks he had once seen in passing. At first it seemed manageable, but within minutes, discomfort sank into his muscles and his breath grew uneven. His mind erupted with noise, questions, doubts, fears, each thought louder than the one before it. The mentor remained silent, offering no guidance, no reassurance, no direction. The mountain seemed to amplify everything within him, reflecting his inner turbulence with merciless honesty. The cold intensified, gripping his body like a tightening band. His knees ached, his back trembled, and a familiar voice inside him began insisting that he had made a mistake coming here. He had imagined training would involve movement, combat, or secret warrior techniques, not this strange confrontation with his own thoughts. His ego whispered that he was meant for greater things than sitting still on a freezing stone. But the mountain cares nothing for ego, and the mentor's silence made it impossible to escape the confrontation he had unknowingly avoided his entire life. As time stretched on, the young man became painfully aware of how fear lived inside his breath. Every inhalation tightened his ribs, every exhalation carried a tremor he couldn't hide. His thoughts scattered like startled birds, reacting to every physical discomfort with panic. Yet the longer he sat, the more he noticed that these reactions had nothing to do with the cold at all. They were habits, patterns of avoidance that had shaped his life long before he arrived at the monastery. Slowly, something subtle began to change. He realized he could observe the discomfort without being controlled by it. The pain in his knees remained, but the panic softened. The cold still bit at his skin, but the fear behind it loosened its grip. For the first time, he experienced the smallest hint of separation between his mind and his reactions, a gap where choice could exist. Modern psychology calls this the emergence of metacognition, but ancient warriors understood it simply as the first gate of discipline. When the mentor finally stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the snow-dusted ground, he studied the young man with the calm of someone who had watched countless students break under the weight of their own minds. "Now you see," he said quietly. "Before you can master a system, you must first meet the self that stands in the way." His voice carried the gravity of the mountain around them, grounding the young man in a truth he could feel more than understand. The young man exhaled a long, trembling breath, releasing something he could not name. It wasn't strength and it wasn't victory, it was recognition. He had faced nothing but his own mind, yet it had been harder than any battle he had imagined. And as he stood from the stone, his legs shaking beneath him, He knew the mountain had only begun its work. The mentor led him away from the courtyard and toward a narrow trail behind the monastery, where ancient pines rose like pillars holding up the pale winter sky. The forest greeted them with a stillness so complete that even the wind seemed reluctant to disturb it. Each step the young man took felt heavy, as though his body were adjusting to the quiet battle he had just fought. The mentor walked ahead, steady and unhurried, his presence carrying the weight of someone who understood the rhythm of the mountain intimately. The young man sensed that what awaited him next was not rest, but another layer of himself he had never confronted. They stopped beside a massive boulder half buried in snow, its surface worn smooth by centuries of storms. The mentor tapped it lightly with the end of his staff, the sound dull and grounded. "This stone survives 1,000 winters because it does not resist the cold," he said. The young man stared at the rock, feeling a strange resentment rise within him, resentment not toward the stone, but toward the idea it represented. He had spent his life resisting everything uncomfortable, believing resistance was a form of strength. The mountain, however, seemed to disagree. The mentor turned toward him, his eyes steady. "You resist your thoughts, your fear, your discomfort. That is why they control you." The words felt sharper than the cold air, cutting through the last fragments of his denial. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, to cling to the image of who he believed he was. Yet the mountain had shown him the truth earlier. His mind had been in chaos long before he sat on the stone, and he had simply never stilled long enough to notice. No sword, no technique, no physical training could overpower the weakness he carried inside. As they continued walking, the young man began to notice details he had ignored before: the sound of snow compressing under his boots, the distant crack of ice shifting on higher cliffs, the faint scent of cedar carried by the breeze. Awareness sharpened when resistance softened. The mentor paused at a small clearing where a frozen river reflected the muted sky in dull silver. He gestured for the young man to sit again, this time facing the river. Unlike earlier, the young man obeyed without hesitation, settling onto the cold ground with a steadier breath. The cold seeped into his legs, but his mind did not rebel as violently as before. Instead of fighting discomfort, he observed it how it traveled along his skin, how his muscles tensed in response, how fear tried to rise again in small waves. He breathed through each sensation, allowing them to exist without demanding they disappear. In this quiet practice, discipline began to take shape not as force, but as awareness. He began to understand that the mountain's first lesson was not about endurance, but about seeing himself without distortion. The mentor stood behind him, silent but present. After a long while, he finally spoke. "Stillness is not the absence of movement. It is the presence of clarity. When you stop running from yourself, the path becomes visible." The young man absorbed the words slowly, feeling them settle in his chest like embers beginning to glow. He did not feel strong yet. He did not feel transformed. But he felt honest, and that honesty felt like the beginning of something real. As the light faded and the river darkened beneath the coming night, the mentor placed a hand on his shoulder. "Tomorrow," he said, "you will learn to walk through fear without running." The young man bowed his head slightly, understanding that today had revealed his fragility and tomorrow would test his courage. Night arrived quietly in the mountains, settling over the monastery like a heavy cloak woven from shadow and cold air. The lanterns inside the wooden halls flickered faintly, their warm glow barely pushing back the darkness that pressed against the walls. After completing his evening chores, the young man expected rest, but the mentor appeared at the doorway with a calm authority that left no room for question. In his hand was a small lantern unlit, and he extended it toward the young man without explanation. The absence of light said more than any instruction could. They stepped beyond the monastery gate, and the world seemed to disappear. The forest swallowed them almost immediately, its tall pines rising like black silhouettes against a starless sky. The trail beneath their feet was narrow and uneven, covered in layers of frost that cracked softly under their weight. Every sound around them felt magnified: the snap of a twig, the whisper of wind through branches, the distant cry of an unseen animal. The young man felt his breath tighten as his instincts warned him of threats that might not exist, yet felt undeniably real. The mentor walked ahead with steady confidence, as if the darkness itself parted for him. "Do you feel it?" he asked without turning around. The young man swallowed before answering. Yes, sensei. The mentor nodded once. Good. Fear is not a sign to retreat. Tonight, it becomes your training. His voice carried the certainty of someone who understood that fear was not an obstacle, but a doorway. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the darkness thickened into something almost physical. The young man's heartbeat grew louder, echoing in his ears like a drum. His mind began to fill the shadows with imagined shapes, eyes watching from the trees, claws hidden behind every trunk, dangers waiting in silence. This was the brain's ancient wiring awakening, the amygdala firing warnings in the absence of information. Modern psychology calls it fear projection, but the mentor would call it illusion, self-created and self-sustained. His breath grew shallow, each inhale carrying a tremor he tried to hide. Your mind is searching for something to fear, the mentor said calmly, sensing the shift in his steps. It hates the unknown. It prefers imaginary danger to actual uncertainty. The young man exhaled shakily, realizing how true the words felt. His fear had little to do with the forest and everything to do with his mind's desperate need for control. The mentor stopped suddenly and turned to face him. Although the young man could barely see his outline, the elder's presence felt grounding. Warriors do not wait for fear to disappear, he said. They walk with it, step by step, breath by breath. The simplicity of the instruction made the young man feel both challenged and strangely relieved. He didn't need to defeat the fear, he only needed to move through it. They resumed walking, but this time, the young man focused on his breath. Each inhale softened the rising panic. Each exhale created a small pocket of clarity. The darkness no longer felt like a predator, but like a vast unknown he was learning to navigate. He still felt fear, raw, pulsing, alive, but it no longer froze his steps. Instead, it followed behind him like a shadow that had lost its authority. When they reached a small clearing, where moonlight spilled weakly through a gap in the canopy, the mentor paused. Tonight, he said, you learned your second lesson. Fear does not dominate the spirit that refuses to run. The young man stood in silence, his heart still pounding, yet steadier than before. For the first time, courage did not feel like a distant ideal. It felt like a breath he had finally taken. They remained in the moonlit clearing for several moments, letting the air settle around them like a second skin. The young man could still feel the aftershocks of fear pulsing lightly through his limbs, but something inside him had shifted. The trembling no longer felt like a sign of weakness, more like proof of something awakening. His breath eased, lengthening on its own, as if his body had remembered a rhythm older than panic. The mentor watched him quietly, acknowledging the internal change without a single word. As they began walking again, the forest seemed different. The darkness was still there, but it no longer pressed against him with the same weight. Instead of imagining hidden threats, he started noticing details he had missed earlier. The soft crunch of frost, the faint trail of footprints weaving through the trees, the pattern of moonlight filtering through the branches. The more he paid attention to reality, the less power his imagination held. Presence, he realized, was not a gift, it was a discipline. The trail led them to a narrow wooden bridge, stretched across a frozen stream. The water beneath was dark and glossy, reflecting only slivers of the moon. The structure looked fragile, its planks aged and crooked, and the young man felt tension rise again. Crossing meant stepping onto something uncertain, something that could fail beneath his weight. His chest tightened, and he paused instinctively, old fears whispering their warnings. The mentor stopped beside him and spoke without judgment. "What does fear tell you now?" he asked. The young man swallowed, feeling the truth gather in his throat. That the bridge might break, that I might fall, that I should turn back. The mentor nodded slowly. "Good. Now breathe, and choose your step, not your fear." The instruction felt impossibly simple, yet undeniably profound. He inhaled deeply, letting air fill the tight spaces in his chest. The breath was shaky at first, but the second was steadier, and the third steadier still. Something softened just enough for movement. He placed one foot onto the bridge. The plank creaked, cold and worn beneath his weight, but it held. He took another breath, then another step. Each movement forward peeled away a layer of imagined danger, revealing the truth beneath. Fear, had been louder than reality. Halfway across, he felt a strange calm settle into his body. The stream glinted beneath him, the wind whispered above him, and his mind, once filled with shadows, felt anchored in the present moment. By the time he reached the other side, his fear had not vanished, but it no longer dictated the path of his feet. He turned to see the mentor crossing without hesitation, joining him with a faint, approving nod. They continued deeper into the forest until it widened into another clearing. The mentor paused, resting both hands on his staff. "This is the nature of fear," he said. "It appears as a wall, but becomes a path when you step toward it. Avoidance strengthens it, presence dissolves it." The young man absorbed every word, feeling their truth echo in his bones. He had always believed courage meant being fearless. Now he understood something far more useful. Courage meant feeling fear and moving anyway. As they made their way back to the monastery, the lantern still unlit, the young man noticed how the darkness no longer swallowed him. Instead, it walked beside him, quiet and unthreatening. Fear was still there, alive, alert, watchful, but it no longer led him, and in that shift, something within him grew stronger. With fear no longer ruling him, the next dawn will confront the enemy that hides beneath pride, the ego he must learn to lay down. Dawn broke with a muted gray light, spreading slowly across the monastery, like a thin veil laid over the stone paths and wooden beams. The young man woke before the morning bell, his body still carrying the memory of the night's fear, but no longer burdened by it in the same way. Instead of panic, he felt a strange steadiness, fragile, but real, like the first flame coaxed from damp wood. As he stepped outside, the cold air wrapped around him with sharp clarity, reminding him that the mountain never softened its lessons merely because he had survived the previous one. The mentor was already waiting in the courtyard, hands folded behind his back, observing the world with quiet attention. Without a word, the mentor handed him a bucket heavy, filled to the brim with water cold enough to sting through the wooden handle. There was no explanation, no teaching, no context. The young man carried the bucket up the stone steps to the kitchen hall, his arms straining against the weight. When he returned, thinking he had completed the task, the mentor simply pointed toward another bucket, and another, and then a stack of firewood that needed carrying. There was no pattern to the commands, no logic, nothing that resembled the heroic warrior training he had imagined before coming to the mountain. It felt menial, degrading, endless. As the hours passed, frustration began tightening inside him like a rope pulled too quickly. He had endured fear in the forest, silence on the stone, and cold on the riverbank. But this constant stream of chores felt insulting. Each task chipped away at the image he held of himself as someone destined for strength, discipline, or greatness. He felt small, insignificant, almost invisible. And yet the mentor watched him with complete neutrality, not offering praise when he complied, nor criticism when he hesitated. That neutrality was its own kind of mirror, forcing him to confront why he felt so wounded. By midday, after sweeping snow from the courtyard for the third time, the young man felt something inside him snap. He leaned against the broom, breath fogging in the air, resentment swirling inside his chest. "Why am I doing this?" he thought. "Anyone could sweep floors. Anyone could carry water. This has nothing to do with becoming a warrior." His hands trembled not from cold, but from the rising heat of anger. The tasks felt beneath him. He felt himself choking on the belief that he deserved something more, something grander. The mentor approached at that moment, silent at first, studying the tension in the young man's shoulders and the fire in his eyes. "Speak," the elder finally said. "Your spirit is loud. Let it be heard." The young man clenched his jaw before muttering, "This isn't real training." The mentor nodded slowly, as if he had been waiting for those words. "Ah," he said, "now we arrive at the truth." His voice remained calm, but the weight of his next sentence struck deeper than any reprimand. "Your ego is what is in pain, not your body." The young man's breath caught. He wanted to deny it, to defend himself, to insist that he wasn't acting out of pride. But the cold clarity of the moment held him firmly. He realized he was not angry at the chores, he was angry at being seen as ordinary. Angry that warrior training wasn't centered on his imagined potential. Angry that the mountain did not care who he thought he was supposed to be. The mentor stepped closer, lowering his voice. Before a warrior can rise, his ego must bow. You cling to an image of yourself that has never endured a single winter. Let it die, and your spirit will finally begin to live. The young man felt the words settle inside him, like stones dropped into deep water, rippling outward in painful, undeniable truth. The afternoon wore on with a quiet heaviness, the kind that forces a person to look inward whether they want to or not. After the mentor's words, the young man picked up the broom again, but this time his movements were slower and more deliberate, as though he was sweeping not just snow but the residue of something deeper within himself. Each push of the broom scraped away another layer of resistance, revealing how tightly he had clung to the idea of being exceptional. The courtyard remained blanketed in white no matter how many times he cleared it, reminding him that the world was indifferent to his pride. Slowly, the anger that had burned so sharply earlier began to fade into something quieter, an uncomfortable but necessary humility. When he finished sweeping the main path, he moved to the steps near the meditation hall. There, as he worked, memories drifted up like sediment stirred by movement. He remembered times in his past when he had refused to take on simple tasks, believing himself meant for bigger things. He remembered the shame he felt when others surpassed him simply because they did the work he had avoided. Most of all, he remembered how often he had quit whenever a task threatened his ego. The realization hit him with surprising force. His struggle had never been with difficulty but with identity. He had protected his pride more fiercely than his own growth. The mentor approached without disturbing the quiet rhythm of the young man's sweeping. "Humility is not self-belittlement," he said gently. "It is the freedom to exist without the weight of who you think you must be." The young man paused, letting the words settle. They felt both unfamiliar and strangely relieving, as though someone had finally named a burden he had carried for years. The mentor continued, "When your ego dies, the world no longer feels like an opponent. It becomes a place where you can learn." The young man nodded, understanding now that the chores were never about labor. They were mirrors. As the sun dipped lower, the tasks continued, carrying water, stacking wood, sweeping new snow. But the resistance inside him had softened. Where earlier he had demanded meaning, now he found meaning in the doing itself. His breath synchronized with the rhythm of each chore. His awareness deepened with each repeated action. In modern terms, he had slipped into a form of meditative flow, an immersive state where effort transformed into presence. Ancient warriors had known this state well, calling it the quieting of the self. It was the beginning of mastery. By the time dusk settled, he felt strangely lighter. His muscles were tired, but his mind was clearer than it had been in years. He realized that the mentor had intentionally given him tasks that stripped away the illusions he had brought to the mountain. Without a grand role, without praise, without recognition, he had met the truth beneath his ambition. The simple desire to grow. It was a desire that did not need to be dressed in pride or heroic fantasies. It was enough to exist on its own. As he put the broom back in its place, the mentor joined him beside the wooden door. "Today you learned that ego is the enemy of discipline," the elder said quietly. "Tomorrow you will learn that discipline is the gradual death of everything that holds you back." The young man bowed his head, not out of obligation, but out of genuine respect, and felt a sense of acceptance bloom where resistance had once lived. With the ego laid bare, the next dawn brings the relentless training of small, repeated deaths that carve a spirit into steel. Morning arrived with a pale gold glow stretching slowly over the mountains, illuminating the monastery roofs that glistened beneath a thin crust of ice. The young man felt the familiar ache in his body as he stepped outside, but this time he didn't resent it. There was a quiet acceptance in the stiffness of his limbs, as if his muscles were learning to bow in their own way. The mentor greeted him with the same calm presence as always and handed him a wooden practice staff. The young man felt a flicker of anticipation finally, he thought, something that resembled real training, but the mentor simply pointed to a marked line on the courtyard floor. "Strike," he said. "Exactly here. Do not stop." The young man obeyed, driving the staff downward onto the line with steady force. Then again, and again, and again. After several minutes, the monotony began to press into him, heavier than the staff itself. He had expected movement, footwork, flow, something dynamic and exciting. Instead, he was trapped in repetition, the same motion carved endlessly into the cold air. An hour passed. His shoulders burned, his hands ached, and the once sharp strikes turned ragged and imprecise. Sweat froze against his skin as the staff grew slippery in his grip. The young man stole a glance at the mentor, hoping for a sign that the exercise was complete or that he had performed well. But the elder simply said, "Again." There was no hint of approval, no reassurance. The message was clear. Discipline does not negotiate. Frustration rose in him, familiar but weaker than before. This training felt pointless, just as sweeping snow had felt pointless. But he pushed through the resistance, trying to focus on the line beneath the staff. Slowly he began to notice something subtle. When he struck carelessly, the staff wavered and bounced. When he struck with full presence, fully noticing the breath, the angle, the tension in his grip, the staff landed exactly where it should. The difference was not strength but attention. Presence, he realized, was precision. The mentor stepped closer, his eyes following the rhythm of the young man's movements. "Most men seek dramatic transformation," he said. "They want the moment of breakthrough, the instant of mastery. But a warrior is forged in repetition, small deaths of laziness, excuses, and ego." Each word seemed to mirror the young man's struggle. Every strike killed something old in him. The desire for quick results, the tendency to drift into distraction, the resentment toward effort. Modern psychology calls this neuroplasticity, the slow rewiring of the brain through consistent patterns. Ancient warriors understood it as shaping the spirit. Hours continued to pass. The world around him faded until there was only the staff, the line, and the sound of impact echoing against the courtyard walls. His arms trembled, not from weakness but from effort that had become honest. He no longer struck to finish the task. He struck to become better in the task. His breath, once scattered and shallow, now flowed with an even cadence that grounded him deeply. The monotony that once suffocated him now steadied him. At last, when the sun had climbed high enough to warm the edge of the courtyard, the mentor raised a hand. "Stop." The young man lowered the staff, chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. The mentor examined the line on the ground, clean, precise, unmistakably marked by hours of focused strikes. "This is the discipline of small deaths," he said. "Nothing grand, nothing glorious, but each one shapes you." The young man stood silently, staff resting against his leg, feeling the truth of those words settle like a slow-burning fire. The mentor signaled for the young man to follow him to a different part of the monastery grounds, where a long wooden beam lay partially buried in snow. The air was sharp, filled with fragments of ice that drifted from the surrounding cliffs. The young man's arms were still trembling from hours of striking, but he lifted the beam when instructed, surprised by how heavy it felt. The mentor walked beside him in silence as they crossed the courtyard, offering no praise for the work already done, no acknowledgement of the pain in his muscles. It was as if the elder expected struggle, expected it as a natural part of transformation, not a reason for sympathy. They reached a raised platform overlooking the valley below. From here, the mountains stretched endlessly, their icy ridges catching the sun in sharp silver streaks. The mentor motioned for him to set the beam down. "Lift it," he said, "then hold." The young man obeyed, gripping the edges and raising it above his head. At first he felt capable, believing strength alone would carry him through, but within moments his arms began to shake, the weight pressing down through his shoulders and spine. He tried adjusting his stance, tightening his grip, controlling his breath, but the trembling intensified. Minutes dragged on, each one stretching longer than the last. His ego whispered that the task was impossible, that no one could hold such weight for so long. His mind begged for relief, urging him to give up, to lower the beam and catch his breath. But the mentor stood in front of him, calm and unmoving. "This is the death of the impulse to stop," the elder said. "That impulse is the enemy that ruins men before their lives have even begun." The young man closed his eyes and breathed through the pain, feeling the truth of those words ignite something fiercely determined within him. His muscles screamed, but the internal battle was louder. Every second demanded a choice: lower the beam and reclaim comfort, or endure and discover what lay beyond the point where most people stop. Slowly, the young man leaned into the sensation, not resisting but observing how his body reacted, how it trembled, how it weakened, how it tried to protect itself through tension and fear. In shifting his focus from resistance to awareness, the pain sharpened but lost its power to control him. This was the discipline the mentor spoke of, the repeated death of excuses, the death of old habits, the death of comfort. When the mentor finally said, "Lower it," the young man's arms collapsed, and the beam slammed into the snow at his feet. He fell to his knees, breath ragged, but spirit surprisingly steady. The mentor crouched beside him, speaking softly. "Strength is not built in the lifting. It is built in the moments you want to stop but don't. These moments shape who you become." His words felt like they were being carved directly into the young man's bones. After a short rest, the mentor had him repeat the lift again and again until the day faded into shades of orange and blue. By the third attempt, the young man no longer questioned the task. He simply did it, allowing the repetition to carve discipline into him like the mountain carved rivers from stone. In the quiet between each breath, he felt pieces of his old self falling away, leaving behind something clearer, sharper, and far more resilient. As the sun dipped behind the peaks and shadows stretched across the valley, the mentor placed a hand on his shoulder. "Today you died many small deaths," he said. "Tomorrow you will discover what is born in their place." With repetition reshaping his spirit, the next lesson leads him into the silence where true presence takes root. Winter deepened around the monastery, coating every surface in a shimmering layer of frost that crackled softly beneath the young man's steps. The air felt thicker now, as if each breath carried the weight of invisible lessons waiting to be understood. After the grueling days of physical training, the young man expected more exertion, more repetition, more tasks that tested the limits of his body. Instead, the mentor led him to a secluded wooden platform overlooking a valley blanketed in snow. The mountains stood silent and unmoving, their white peaks catching the pale morning sun like blades of polished steel. "Sit," the mentor said simply. There was no staff, no weight to lift, no path to sweep. The young man obeyed, crossing his legs beneath him as he faced the endless horizon. The wind moved gently across the valley, brushing cold against his cheeks, but the space felt different, less confrontational than the courtyard, less threatening than the dark forest. It was a silence that invited rather than demanded. The mentor settled beside him, placing his hands on his knees with slow, intentional motion. "Today," he said, his voice quiet but clear, "you will learn presence not as an idea, but as a state of being. A warrior's calm is not the absence of chaos, but the ability to remain unmoved within it." The young man took a slow breath, trying to steady himself. At first, he focused on his breathing the way he had during the earlier sitting exercises, but his mind resisted. Thoughts flickered like restless birds, memories of the beam lifting, fears of failing, questions about the next test. Each thought pulled him away from the stillness the mentor asked him to find. Minutes stretched, feeling longer with each passing moment. The young man shifted slightly, trying to ease the stiffness in his back. Silence pressed against him, not heavy like before, but deep in a way that revealed how scattered he still was inside. "Your mind is loud," the mentor said, sensing the turbulence without looking. "It clings to movement because stillness exposes it." The young man tried again to focus, but it felt as if the more he resisted the noise, the louder it grew. Then the mentor added, "Do not chase the silence, let it arrive." The words landed differently. Instead of forcing his mind into quiet, he stopped trying altogether. He sat with the noise. He let the thoughts come and go without following them. He allowed the discomfort, the boredom, the restlessness, letting each sensation exist without judgment. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, something shifted. The noise inside him softened, like distant echoes fading into the corners of a cavern. The wind moved differently now, or perhaps he was hearing it differently. He noticed the subtle variations in its tone, the faint rustle of snow sliding from branches, the quiet crackle of ice thawing beneath the weak sun. The world expanded around him, not outward but inward, as if space itself had opened within his chest. His breath deepened, his shoulders loosened, his heart settled into a steady rhythm. This, he realized, was the early shape of presence, not a silence forced by discipline, but a calm that emerged from acceptance. The mentor, sensing the shift, spoke again. Most people drown in their thoughts because they believe every thought is a command. Presence is the art of realizing thoughts are only visitors. The young man felt the truth of that. For the first time, his thoughts felt like clouds drifting across a vast sky rather than storms he needed to control. He was not empty. He was aware. As the cold air moved across their faces and the vast valley stretched before them in silent majesty, the young man felt something he had never experienced before. A calm that did not come from escaping life, but from facing it fully. The silence around them deepened as the sun climbed slowly across the winter sky, casting long shadows across the wooden platform. The young man remained still, surprised by how easily his body settled now compared to the earlier struggles he had endured. His breath moved with a natural rhythm, neither forced nor fragile. For the first time since arriving at the monastery, he felt as though he was not wrestling with the world around him or with himself. The mentor watched quietly, knowing that presence was never taught through explanation, but through experience. As the minutes continued to stretch, the young man noticed a subtle shift in his perception. The cold air no longer felt hostile but cleansing. The distant sound of icicles cracking became a rhythm instead of a distraction. Even the intermittent tremors in his legs felt like simple sensations rather than threats demanding attention. His mind had not become perfectly silent, but its noise had softened into something he could observe without being dragged into. It was a kind of internal spaciousness, as if awareness itself had grown larger than the thoughts moving through it. Modern neuroscience calls this an expansion of attentional bandwidth, but the mentor would have described it simply as the mind returning to its natural form. He opened his eyes slowly and found the horizon pulsing with soft light. The valley looked impossibly vast, untouched by the struggles humans carried within themselves. For a moment, he felt connected to it, part of the stillness, part of the breath of the mountains, part of the world that continued quietly regardless of his fears or ambitions. The mentor finally spoke, his voice as calm as flowing water. This is the warrior's calm, not an escape from life, but clarity within it. His words did not disrupt the stillness. They seemed to arise from it. They sat a while longer before the mentor rose gracefully to his feet. "Follow," he said. They walked through a pathway lined with frost-kissed pines until they reached a narrow cliffside ledge overlooking a deeper stretch of the valley. The wind was stronger here, carrying a cold that bit more sharply at the skin. The mentor instructed him to stand at the edge, feet planted firmly, eyes forward. "Now remain," he said. "Not as stone, but as sky." The young man stood with a stillness he did not know he possessed. The wind pressed hard against him, tugging at his clothes and hair, testing his balance. Yet inside, he felt anchored. He understood the purpose of this practice. Presence meant holding steady not in perfect conditions, but in conditions that constantly threatened to shake him loose. The world would not stop moving, so he needed to learn to stop being carried by it. Minutes passed, and the wind grew stronger. The young man felt his mind reach instinctively for fear, for doubt, for escape. But presence gave him a different kind of strength, one that did not come from tightening but from allowing. He let the wind push and swirl around him, but he did not internalize its force. He remained upright, balanced, aware. This was the calm that warriors cultivated, the ability to remain clear in chaos, stable in turbulence, and awake in every moment. When the mentor finally gestured for him to step back, the young man felt as though he had crossed into a new part of himself. A softness lived inside him now, a quiet center, untouched by noise or fear. "Presence," the mentor said, placing a hand on his shoulder, "is the root of the unbreakable spirit. Without it, strength collapses. With it, strength becomes effortless." As they walked back toward the monastery, the young man felt every sound, every breath, every step with greater clarity than ever before. He was not becoming someone new, he was returning to who he had always been beneath the noise. From this calm center, he will face his final test, the storm that will reveal whether his spirit can truly remain unshaken. A deep stillness hung over the mountains the next morning, the kind of silence that settles just before something powerful arrives. The sky was heavy with low gray clouds, thick and unmoving, giving the landscape an eerie dimness, even though dawn had already broken. The young man stepped out into the courtyard and immediately felt the tension in the air. The birds that usually fluttered between the pine branches were nowhere to be seen. The wind, normally restless, held its breath. It was as if the mountain itself was bracing for what was coming. The mentor stood near the main hall, his posture straight and unwavering despite the growing pressure in the atmosphere. He studied the sky carefully before turning to the young man. "A storm is coming," he said. "Not a gentle one. The kind that strips trees from the earth." The young man felt a flicker of uncertainty, but it did not grow into fear as it once would have. His breath remained steady, anchored by the presence he had been cultivating. The mentor nodded slightly, recognizing the shift within him. "Today, the mountain will test what your spirit has become." They moved quickly toward the outer structures of the monastery, where loose wooden panels and storage sheds stood exposed to the brewing storm. The wind began to rise, swirling around them with sharp bursts that carried flecks of snow. Each gust grew stronger, pulling at their clothes and stinging their skin. The young man could feel the old instinct to tense up, to react with panic, pressing lightly at the edges of his mind. But he breathed through it, allowing the sensation to exist without surrendering to it. "Secure everything," the mentor instructed. "The storm will not wait for doubt." Together they began fastening shutters, tying ropes around beams, and reinforcing doors. The tasks demanded urgency. The wind howled louder with each passing minute, turning the peaceful monastery into a place under siege. Snow began to fall, not in gentle flakes, but in thick, heavy sheets whipped sideways by the rising gale. The young man's hands stung from the cold, and his muscles strained with every effort, yet his mind remained clear. There was no frantic scrambling, no spiraling fear, only steady action. As they worked their way around the main hall, a sudden crack echoed from the far side of the courtyard. A large wooden gate, weakened by age, had begun to split under the pressure of the wind. Without waiting for instruction, the young man sprinted toward it. Snow and debris whipped past him, but he moved with a calm decisiveness that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. Reaching the gate, he grabbed a fallen beam and braced it against the splitting wood, using his shoulder and full weight to keep it from collapsing. The force of the storm crashed against him, pushing harder with each gust, but he anchored his feet into the snow and held. The mentor arrived seconds later, helping reinforce the gate with additional beams. "Hold," he commanded, his voice cutting through the roar of the storm. And the young man did. His breath flowed evenly, even as his muscles burned and the wind battered him. His mind did not run ahead into fear or fall behind into doubt. He was entirely present, each moment experienced fully but without attachment. The storm raged, but it did not penetrate the quiet center he had built through silence, fear, humility, and discipline. For a long moment, it felt as though the mountain, the storm, and the young man existed in a single suspended breath. He felt the raw power of the elements pressing against him, but he also felt the unyielding strength arising from within, a strength separate from anger, pride, or desperation. It was the strength of a spirit that no longer shattered under pressure. The storm intensified until the world became a blur of white and gray, each gust slamming against the monastery walls with a force that felt almost alive. The young man continued to brace the gate with the mentor beside him, their combined strength holding the wood in place as the wind screamed like 1,000 voices. Ice stung his cheeks, the cold biting deep into his skin, but his breath remained steady. He no longer reacted to the storm with panic or resistance. He simply allowed it to be what it was, wild, relentless, uncontrollable, while remaining anchored in the calm he had forged within himself. Eventually, the mentor shouted above the roaring wind, "Release, but move with awareness." They stepped back at the same moment, replacing their bodies with a reinforced beam secured tightly across the gate. The wood groaned under the weight of the storm, but it held. The young man felt his heart pounding, not with fear but with something closer to exhilaration, a clarity born from being fully present in danger without being consumed by it. The mentor placed a hand on his shoulder briefly, an unspoken acknowledgement of the transformation now impossible to deny. They continued working across the courtyard, fastening ropes, reinforcing weak beams, and guiding loose objects into sheltered spaces. The young man found himself anticipating the mentor's instructions before they were given. His awareness expanded and finely tuned. Where once his mind would have splintered under pressure, now it moved in clean, decisive lines. Presence had sharpened him, Fear had humbled him, and discipline had strengthened him. He was no longer reacting to the storm, he was acting within it. A sudden crack split the air as one of the smaller storage sheds began to buckle. Without hesitation, he sprinted toward it, snow whipping into his eyes as the wind nearly shoved him off balance. He dropped to the ground near the base of the structure, examining the failing support beam. The roof sagged dangerously, threatening to collapse under the weight of snow. Instead of freezing or stepping back, he pressed his palms into the cold earth, steadied his breath, and assessed the situation like the mentor had taught him. Observe, then act. He found a fallen plank nearby and wedged it beneath the weakening beam, using his shoulder to lift the structure just enough for the plank to take weight. The movement was not one of strength alone, it was one of alignment, timing, and clarity. Once the plank was in place, the shed steadied. He exhaled, a slow breath that felt like a quiet victory over every past version of himself who would have panicked or hesitated. When he returned to the mentor, the elder studied him for a long moment. The storm still raged, but the young man stood rooted, calm, despite the chaos swirling around them. "Your training was never about swords," the mentor said over the howling wind. "It was about this. The moment when the world demands your presence and you do not break." The young man met his gaze, understanding now that every test, every challenge, every discomfort had been preparing him for this exact kind of clarity. Hours later, the storm began to settle. The wind weakened, the snow softened, and the oppressive weight in the air lifted. The monastery, battered but still standing, emerged from the white haze like a survivor rising from deep water. The young man surveyed the damage, his breath slow and grounded. Even in exhaustion, he felt a strength that had nothing to do with muscle or endurance. It came from a place deeper than body, rooted in presence, humility, and the death of fear. As the final gusts faded into silence, the mentor stood beside him. "You are ready," he said, "not because you conquered the storm, but because you conquered the part of yourself that once shattered under pressure." The young man bowed, feeling the truth of those words resonate through him like a steady heartbeat. When dawn arrived the next day, he descended the mountain path, no longer the frightened boy who had arrived weeks earlier, but a man carrying a stillness stronger than any blade. The unbreakable spirit is forged not by force, but by meeting oneself fully with discipline, presence, and unwavering honesty.